everybody. Welcome to SneakCon. I'm Alyssa Miller. It's my absolute honor and pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for joining me today. We are talking all about threat modeling in DevSecOps. So yeah, I said it. You heard it. DevSecOps and threat modeling, they do go together. So before I get started, a little bit about me. I am a hacker and a researcher. I have been hacking computers since I bought my first one at 12 years old. I taught myself basic programming and got pretty deep into some things pretty quickly. I'm also a security advocate here at Snyk. I focus on our security community and reaching out and better bringing the Snyk message to security practitioners and security leaders to understand how we get into DevSecOps. I'm an author and a blogger currently working on my first book, and I co-host a podcast called The Uncommon Journey. So I want to talk to you today, as I said, about threat modeling. Now, I remember back in my days as a consultant, I was working with this organization that had a very well-defined threat modeling program, and they'd really made it efficient to the point that they had it down to where it only took about a day or two to do threat modeling. And, it consisted of some meetings, some diagrams, and some questionnaires, and then a lot of analysis like you would expect with threat modeling. And I remember walking out of one of the meetings and spending a few minutes in the hall talking to a developer who I had spoken with many times before. We had done a number of these threat model exercises. And he said to me, I can't wait until we don't have to do these anymore. And I looked at him kind of quizzically and said, what do you mean? Why wouldn't you have to do these anymore? And he said, well, we're moving to DevOps and you can't threat model in DevOps. So that got me thinking, like, wait a minute. Threat modeling is really important. There's a lot of good reasons why we threat model, and it's an important thing to do. So why do people feel like you can't do threat modeling in DevOps, and what do we do about that? So if you're familiar with threat modeling at all, you're very likely familiar with this book by Adam Shostak. This is kind of the Bible or the gold standard as it comes to threat modeling. It's the definitive guide on how do you threat model. And it stood the test of a lot of years. But the one thing missing from this is that it defines a lot of different methodologies and things that are kind of tough to accept, especially when you're trying to move to a very agile, very dynamic environment like what we see in DevOps and in particular CI/CD. So if we look at some of the things that are inside this book, it talks about the idea of DFDs or data flow diagrams. And these are diagrams that are supposed to be created early on in the threat modeling process. And they're supposed to basically detail the entire functionality of the system, where data flows, where it crosses trust boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. Then we go from that and we create these attack maps where we talk about all the different ways that a threat might attack our system. And then when we start talking about those threats, we categorize them according to this category system called STRIDE. And as you can see, STRIDE is really very technically focused. It's talking about spoofing and tampering and repudiation, and a lot of words that a lot of people outside of security don't necessarily have a good context for what they mean. But that wasn't enough. Then we had to look at, how do we risk rate these threats? And we came up with this thing called DREAD. And DREAD talks about risks in terms of what kind of damage can they cause, are they reproducible, are they exploitable, how many users are affected, and who are those users, and how discoverable are these threats, etc. And then and then we lay this all into this model where we're supposed to do it over and over and over again. And as we define these threats and we start to identify them over time, we became aware that maybe we should start to organize this more. And so this thing called the CAPAC taxonomy came to being. And this was supposed to make life easier, but look at how complex that can be when you map that out. And so the result of all this is that threat modeling is always perceived as this very heavyweight, very difficult, long process that ultimately loses business context. It's very point in time based. And it's just way too focused on the technical aspects and doesn't focus on what we really need to know. And then in 2008, DevOps came into being. And things got even worse, where having a heavyweight methodology like this for threat modeling just isn't going to fit anymore. We're trying to move faster and faster and faster, but you got security folks saying, hey, we need to do threat modeling. So you got to slow down, and we got to do all these diagrams and LS analysis before you even get started in developing your system. And that's just not going to work. We know that. Developers working in DevOps, that's the last thing you want to hear is, hey, slow down. So I got to thinking, what can we possibly do about this? And it was clear that we needed to do something very different from a security perspective. So I said, let's just go back to basics. I need to just look at this problem a little bit differently. So let's get back to the very start. First of all, what is threat modeling? And I did some searching, I did some research, and what I found is there is no concise answer for this. I consulted OWASP, I consulted Microsoft, Wikipedia, you name it. The only thing that these sources had in common was that they all had different views, and that for every one of them, it was a lengthy definition. There was no simple, concise definition of what even threat modeling was. So that made my next question more complex to answer, and that question is, why do we threat model? So if I'm going to try to build a new way of thinking of threat modeling into DevSecOps, I need to understand why we do it and what it even is. So after looking for all these answers and finding no definitive answer, what did I do? Well, I got back to basics. What is threat modeling? The reality is threat modeling is very simply just answering the question, what could possibly go wrong? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at our system that we're developing and saying, what are the things that could go wrong here and how do we address them? So with that, and realizing that that was really just the basic gist of it, I found this definition. Threat modeling is nothing more than identifying the likely threats to a system to inform the design of security countermeasures. Now, I found that in my own head. I had to write that because I couldn't find anything even close to this concise. So I think we understand identifying threats. That makes sense. Okay, so I understand there's different things that could be bad for my system. I'm going to identify what could possibly go wrong. But Alyssa, what do you mean by this inform the design of likely or of countermeasures? So at its core, threat modeling is meant to provide us information that shapes the entire delivery pipeline. We start with our threat model. We identify this threat information, but we don't just call it out there and forget about it, of course. Why do we want that threat information? Well, as we move into that planning phase, we're going to be building security requirements. Now, we may not be, especially in a CI/CD environment, those security requirements may not be written. They may not be documented in any way, but somewhere a developer is getting a hold of that particular user story or that particular requirement that they're going to build. And the first thing they got to do is think about just how they're going to do it. That's the planning phase in DevOps. So this gives us the ability to think about security requirements because now we have an understanding of what the threats are that we need to address. So as I move into building it then as a developer, I can start to build in security controls that address those threats. But it doesn't stop there. If I've got that documented threat information and I know what security controls I've built to address those threats, that gives me some really great information that I can pass on for purposes of building test cases when we come to that, ultimately that testing phase of our delivery pipeline. So now I know what the most important things are that I need to test. I don't necessarily, yeah, sure, we'll run the wide spanning DAS tools and all the other automated stuff that we do, but I can focus my efforts on key areas that represent true threats in my software. And then finally, when we promote to production, we're ready for deployment and we move ahead, I can inform the monitoring. So we set up the monitoring to watch for those same test cases. Now, why is threat modeling so important? Puppet and Circle CI in their State of DevOps report looked at different security practices and they plotted them out as you see here. On the y-axis, we've got the frequency of how often those practices occur within a delivery pipeline. And along the x-axis, the importance or the impact that those security practices have on the security posture of that system or even that entire organization. Now, if you look in the far lower left here, what you see is what doesn't happen often, but has the most impact on security posture are these collaborative efforts in threat modeling. This is why we threat model. It makes us more secure. So what if I told you that you can do threat modeling and it doesn't break your DevOps? This is the tripping point. This is where people start to look at me like I'm nuts. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, I am a little crazy, but I'm not crazy when I say this. So let's talk about what DevSecOps really is. When we talk about DevSecOps or even DevOps, we oftentimes have this tendency to become over-focused on tooling. We think about automation all the time. Everybody gets into that mode of we're going DevOps and we're going to get to a CI/CD environment and we're going to be deploying continuously. And so we need to have all the automation in place. In fact, I did a search. I looked up some Google Analytics, and if I look at the top 20 searches that include the term DevSecOps, well, DevSecOps is number one. What is DevSecOps is number two. Number three is DevSecOps tools. It's not until we get down to number 9 that we see DevSecOps practices, and number 10, DevSecOps methodology. We don't even think about that process side of things. And what about the people? What about governance? All of these things are a part of DevSecOps. That's because DevSecOps isn't automation. It isn't a tool. DevSecOps is a culture. It's a way of working differently so that we can bring devs together with ops, together with security, and get everybody working towards these common goals. It's a shared responsibility for ensuring that our software is developed quickly, developed with stability, and developed securely. So when we start to think about DevSecOps that way, and we lose the idea of just focusing on tools, we see why threat modeling and it's the information that it provides us throughout all of these practices, why that's so critical to making DevSecOps successful. Now, when we talk about traditional threat modeling, this is where it lands. We think about threat modeling and it happens in that design phase. So I mentioned all these, these attack trees we draw out and the DFD diagrams we're going to create. And sometimes people throw architecture diagrams and other things in there too. And it's all part of, it's really designed for working in a development paradigm that includes a lengthy design cycle. But we're talking DevOps. That doesn't happen anymore. We don't have the luxury of these long design cycles. And in fact, if we're moving to CI/CD, there is no room for that whatsoever. Anything that's going to slow down this pipeline breaks this pipeline. So we need to become more dynamic. We need to become more a part of the phases when we think about security practices in DevSecOps. And I tell people this all the time. The traditional focus of security has always been we create gates between these different phases. Well, if we're going to work in CI/CD, if we're going to work in DevSecOps, hey, security folks, we got to stop being gates and we need to start being integrated into these phases. We're not gates between them anymore. So you've got CI/CD, your continuous integration, your continuous deployment. But if I want to bring security into that, I need to focus on the other CI. What do I mean? The other CI. God, well, Alyssa, you got all sorts of weird ideas here, right? Yeah, I do. But the other CI is continuous improvement. We talk about it a lot in the development spaces, but we forget about it when it comes to security oftentimes. All too often, we think about security and you think about that giant DFD diagram that we do in traditional threat modeling. Well, it's focused on the system as a whole. It's focused on identifying every possible threat across an entire system. That doesn't work anymore. It was never realistic. We were never going to find all the threats and address them all. So we need to focus on this idea of continuous improvement, getting better day over day. How do I make sure that I'm more secure this week than I was last week? That's what I need to do. And I need to take things in bite-sized chunks. Now, for 2 decades in security, we've been talking about this idea of push left. And if I want to get this whole threat modeling thing into a DevOps pipeline, well, I really need to push left, because I need to push left far enough that anything that's going to take up extra time or create extra friction is as far left in the cycle as possible, so it creates as little friction as possible. Additionally, I'm trying to use threat modeling to inform all those subsequent phases and to make them more efficient. So the sooner in the pipeline I can do my threat modeling, the better. Now, what is the earliest I can possibly get in the pipeline? I got to thinking about this, and I realized the answer that addresses all of these problems. It's the user story. We have business people. They might be business analysts. Who knows? I mean, every organization is different. But somewhere there's somebody that's writing user stories, and they're putting them in a backlog. Can I get any farther left than my backlog? No, that's where it all begins. So in the spirit of DevSecOps being this culture, why don't I reach out and start to bring my business people into this process as well? If I can build in threat modeling information into my user story, now during sprint planning, when I take that user story, it becomes part of my sprint. Or if I'm in CI/CD, where I just have even more freedom to grab a user story that is prioritized in some other way and just begin development, in that user story, I've got the information that I need to inform my planning, so I understand the threats and what I need to deal with from a security requirements perspective. I can then build those security controls that address them. I can feed that information on, that now feeds into my test cases, because our functional test cases are built off the user story. So of course, why shouldn't my security test cases be built off the same user story? And then when we get to monitoring, we still have that intelligence that carries all the way through and says, here's how you can monitor this in production. So how do we do this? Let's look at this. I want to talk about how you take threat modeling and put it into a user story. And for this, I'm going to use an example. I'm going to take one of the user stories here. It's a very simple one. The young professional driver wants to install maps so that they can navigate to places easier. So let's assume we've got a mobile app similar to the mapping software that's out there from the big players. And we'll use this user story to talk about how we do this practically. So in traditional threat modeling, we built these DFDs. I've talked about them all throughout this session so far. We're going to throw these away, because we cannot sit down. If we're doing this at a user story level, trying to drop a DFD of the entire system is pointless. And again, that's heavyweight. It takes a lot of time and takes a lot of input from a lot of people. We want to simplify this. And I said, let's bring the business people who are writing those user stories into this. I don't want them to have to understand all these technical details that we do in traditional threat modeling. They don't need to understand what trust boundaries are and where databases are going to live. That requires an understanding of the design that doesn't exist yet when we're at the user story. So instead, I want my business people to answer this simple question, and it's a takeoff of what I said before. What's the worst thing that could happen? Look at that user story, and based on that user story and the functionality that introduces, what is the worst thing that could happen? That's what I want them to tell me. Now, how do they get there? Well, they got to start by identifying for me what my critical assets are. They might be private data. They might be the ability just to deliver a critical function, just the ability to actually use whatever that functionality is. They might be financial assets, people assets, or even secrets. If I think about private data in terms of our user story, this mapping software, well, a person's location data would be private data. Even if everything else about it's anonymized, the fact that somebody might be able to compromise that data could be a significant issue. Critical functions, just the availability of the application and its ability to receive GPS coordinates. What about financial assets? Well, if we charge a fee for this tool, certainly there's some issues there. People, well, we're trying to protect the user or the driver in particular, because again, that particular functionality could be exploited to hurt them. And from secrets perspective, who knows what kind of trade secrets, maybe just the imagery that we use for those maps. So then I want to move on, and I want my business people to think about what the actual threats are given those critical assets. But I don't want them to use Stride, Again, Stride is very technically focused. Instead, I want them to think about things in very plain language terms. So theft, could those user fees be stolen if we're charging for this? Fraud, could somebody use the app to create phony location history based on where somebody's been, and then they could use that for all sorts of nefarious uses? Exposed data. I mentioned this idea of collecting the user's location information and compromising that, and then potentially using that for other attacks. And what about interrupted business? Well, they could deny somebody access to the application or to the GPS or to the maps, however they attack it that way. So these are the threats. They don't require a big heavy-duty Stride categorization. I don't need all that technical context. I just need my business people to explain it in these simple terms. So all of this ends up in the user story. Now, when a developer is assigned that story and they start to think about how they're going to build this, the first thing they have to do is they need to translate those critical assets into what IT or design components are going to be a part of what they're building. And then they need to think about how attackers could attack them. So now we start to introduce the technical components. And we do that with people who understand the technical implementations of what they're going to be doing. But I don't want my developers drawing attack trees and everything like this for a user story that, again, becomes pointless, and it creates a lot of effort that we just don't need. So we're going to throw those away. We're going to forget about that. Because that huge attack tree, well, that requires an understanding of all the threats to the system. And again, our scope is limited just to this user story and just to those critical assets and the threats that they are at risk of. So if I limit the scope, this becomes far more manageable and it makes sense. And it's just something that happens the same way as a developer. I'm looking at a functional user story and I'm thinking about functional requirements. I think about the same thing then with security requirements. Now, how do I go about dealing with this? I'm going to ask that developer for each threat that was identified to create 3 countermeasures that address that threat. So there's 3 different types of countermeasures. I want them to create one of each. The first is detection. How do we detect that there's potentially a threat? So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to take just one of those threats. We're going to go back to that idea of the user's location data being exposed. And we'll consider a man-in-the-middle attack as the most likely way somebody would probably attack that. So how do I detect that someone's conducting a man-in-the-middle? Well, simple. I use certificate pinning so that if I know what server-side certificate my client application is expecting, and it gets a different certificate because someone's conducting a man-in-the-middle attack on the unsecured Wi-Fi that I'm attached to or whatever, I can detect that threat. I can detect that that attack is occurring. But then I want them to build a mitigation defense. And a mitigation defense is just that thing that gives us time to respond to what we've detected. So you think about like moats around a castle or the big yards between castle walls, or you think about here, I've got, I'm a big Star Wars fan, so Return of the Jedi, the shield around the Death Star. All these things were just meant to buy time for them to respond to an attack. So if I think about this from a perspective where potentially location data is being exposed, well, what if I implement internal caching? So I'm not sending as much location data. I don't need to keep sending it to the server because I can cache that internally and cache the images that go with it. And all of that can happen within the app. And so that's not being transmitted and captured by the man in the middle. And then finally, there's the idea of protection defenses. And these are those active defenses that help protect me from a threat. And in this case, it's encrypt that coordinate data. Sure, I'm already probably using SSL if I'm doing certificate pinning in particular. I'm transmitting over a secure channel. But if that was somehow compromised and I'm thinking about, again, the man in the middle is happening, I can still protect those coordinates by encrypting them and obfuscating them from that attacker. So if I do this, now this is all naturally part of the development cycle. It's on the developer. They can create this easily, and we know what to test for when it comes time for test cases. So as I wrap up, I want to leave you with this quote. And it's very simple, and this is really a call out to everybody out there to think about this differently. You can't change where we're headed and get more secure if we keep doing the things that got us here. It doesn't work that way. So we need to think about them differently. So with that, I invite you all to continue the conversation. Here's my contact information. You've got my Twitter handle, my LinkedIn, my website. You can also contact me through Snyk as well, alyssa.miller@snyk.io. I'm happy to definitely talk about these concepts more with you. And with that, I want to say a great big thank you to Snyk for having me here at SnykCon. Thank you, more importantly, to all of you for your time and attention. I really hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you got some value from it. And I would love to hear your ideas on how we can continue to evolve this and think about threat modeling differently when it comes to DevSecOps. Have a wonderful rest of the conference. Thank you so much.